presenters from last week and also the very first week, just to address a number of the questions which I pulled out of the chat, what we didn't have time to answer, but also just to unpick and explore from your perspectives based upon the work you've been doing, what were the skill deficits in retrospect? What would you have put in place which weren't in place at the time? After that, we'll be using an interactive board. On the interactive board, it's a bit of a skills audit, really. I'm going to be asking you just to really share what skills do you think from your organisational perspective should be there, which currently aren't there. Following that, also, what are the platforms to learn these set of skills, what you've identified? Following that, we've got a brief presentation from Beth, who joined us on the call last week, who will really give us a bit of a case study about her particular service in Suffolk and what their challenges are in terms of building up skills, and I guess what her future needs are. And we will wrap up with another Q&A, and that would constitute our 60 minutes together. So on that note, I will just hand over to Noel at this point, and I'll kind of let people in from the lobby, Noel, while you kind of do some context setting, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those of you who've been here before, you'll have heard me talk about how we're developing a framework to improve how we do participation at Newham, and we're really keen to open it up to other councils and other organisations to share that learning and develop it together. What I didn't mention, which is more relevant for this particular session and the one next week, which is we're also looking to develop a participation academy. So that would be a training programme for people to learn how to do participation together, in particular with underrepresented groups and marginalised communities, and to do that through focusing on kind of particular issues and particular projects where there's a need from that. So that would be people from kind of different local areas, different local organisations, and so this is there's a link into this session and kind of next week's in terms of what the skills that we need to develop. But obviously what we want to hear from you is kind of what skills do we need to develop that can also help you in the areas that you have in terms of engagement and participation in your organisations as well. So that's a brief intro.
Fabulous, thank you, Noel. And so to begin then with today's workshop, if I can ask everybody to go off screen, barring the presenters. So we've got Toby in the room. I don't know if George is joining you today, Toby.
He is planning to join, but he's had an emergency FOI come in, so he's currently running on that.
Okay then, so we've got George, we've got Toby, we've got Clive. Do we have Amy and Chris from Newham? Do we have Amy or Chris? And do we have Imogen?
Imogen would have been at Redbridge, and I'll be replacing Imogen.
Oh, okay then, is it Suzanne?
Yeah, Suzanne.
Okay, nice to meet you, Suzanne. Okay then, so if we can have on the panel then Suzanne, Toby and Clive. And there was a few questions posed last week what we didn't get to address.
Sorry, Darren. Darren, I am replacing someone called Imogen, but I don't think it's someone that was on the panel. Or if it is, then I've possibly not been told about that.
Well, in fact, I think Imogen actually was not from Redbridge. She was from Islington.
Oh,
so
okay.
it's yes, a different Imogen then in this case. And so Toby and Clive then, a couple of the questions what was raised from last week was about how do you approach synthesizing data? And I think this was due to the kind of, it may be more the Toby question, but the range of sources of data you collected from residents. How did you really make sense of it? I think that was the nut of the question.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the honest answer is that there wasn't an easy solution. So we designed a process where we just had a huge Excel document. We had 3 members of the team, one of which was myself, and we went through all of the data in 3 different kind of independent ways to see what results came out of it. So we tried to do it by data source, so looking at kind of workshops independently and what were the key themes that came out of that, ethnographic, etc. We also looked at it by group, so in terms of the target groups of residents, so kind of what were the key things that disabled people have said, what were the key things that South Asian women have said, and then the third, so we had by source, by group, and by theme as well. So we also broke it down by looking at it in terms of the thematic areas that came up. So what do people say about cost of living and how that impacts, and what do people say about kind of recruitment practices. So put all of that in three different ways onto a huge Excel document, and then actually I'm sure not good practice in terms of how to actually analyze data, but we went through that, and then we worked out kind of which were the things that came up more frequently, and kind of just worked from there and kind of narrowed it down into the 4 themes that we eventually used for the summit. So yeah, I don't have a solution for how to do data analysis. I'd be very interested to see what other people have done, and if there's anyone on the call that has done a similar process of multi-method engagement and how they've done data analysis, I'd be very keen to hear that.
Yeah, and it sounds very much like you did a thematic analysis actually. And I guess my follow-up question was, did you feel like you was in control of the process, or at some point did the data overwhelm you?
I think we felt relatively in control. I mean, the whole process took 3 people about a week and a half to do, so it wasn't a quick process. So in terms of the quantity of data, it was overwhelming. I think there was over 100 challenges. I think 70 something solutions that residents identified as well. Obviously, you were getting these in kind of 3 different ways and from multiple different areas. So you had to kind of count how many times each thing had come up as well. Yeah, so it was relatively overwhelming, but we managed to develop a system that worked for us to analyze it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Toby. The next question, I guess, Clive, well, you can both address this really, is how do you prevent engagement fatigue in the residents you've been working with?
Well, so I come at this from a democratic accountability perspective, and from that space, and in fact, in relation just to the previous comments made by Toby, the challenge for us is translating that data into perspectives that so politicians that are engaging with potentially a range of key stakeholders, external stakeholders, not just residents but partners as well, and other entities that are active in our borough, is how do we take that complex data and translate it into information that elected members who live busy lives anyway, and who are sitting in a democratic accountability space, who then have potentially, witnesses in front of them, and how do they turn that data into meaningful questions, meaningful areas to probe, and meaningful areas to potentially even come from a meeting, with information that they could turn into potential recommendations. And the other element of that, and this is true for all sorts of outputs of engagement, including things like resident surveys and all sorts of ways of engaging, is how do we translate those sets of data into, obviously then, on the one hand, information for elected members so that they can usefully use this information, on the other to suggest perhaps ways of engagement and stakeholder groups, whether those are however they're defined, for the purposes of the objectives which any commission, any democratic accountability commission might be seeking to engage. And that engagement includes informal engagement, doesn't have to be at a public meeting. So I just wanted to add that, if that's okay, and I may have strayed from the second question, for which I apologize.
No, that's fantastic, Clive. And have you found a solution to that particular problem?
So it's very, I wish there was a one size fits all solution, and often I think it boils down to something which you invited us to address potentially later, I don't know, which is about skills deficits and opportunities to increase ability. And so some, certainly in the democratic accountability space, some, members will have varied backgrounds. So some will engage with the data and be very familiar with data sets and working to do what I was describing, and others, come from all sorts of walks of life, where it really does then boil down to the support that they get from the officer specialists in the context of, and that support can vary in terms of translating potentially complex, and the other one then, which is a bit of a solution, and I suppose it was also potentially a question for Noel, is, so we, in Newham, we're putting in place what we call a member development program, and this is nothing new. Councils, anyone here on from a council will recognise, the member development program and the hope we place in those programs, which, for better or for worse, are one way of solving that, and potentially the participation academy, which is why I mentioned Noel when he'd mentioned that is, might there be options for councillors in that. So just those comments.
Okay, no, thank you, Clive. And can you just define what you mean by development programme for those who aren't familiar with it?
Yeah, so broadly speaking, it's a series of workshops and information sessions which enable councillors, elected members, to better understand their remits on the one hand, the roles they've been given within the council, and from a democratic accountability perspective, also enable them to have skills such as how to appropriately question various participants. So those can range in age from very young to, they can range in terms of background, etc. So questioning, engagement methods, how might they, if they want to conduct a review. So for example, we're looking at a review around the relationship between, very specifically, black boys in our borough and their relationship with the council and the borough. And so, it would be important for, in the democratic accountability space, those elected members to understand the various methods they can use to engage with that specific group. And I use this just by way of example because the thematic, the thematic engagement space could be, it ranges, from anything from flooding in the borough right through to whatever, So I think those are, again, just some perspectives on that.
No, thank you, Clive. And that's really a good emphasis, really. But it's a toolkit solution, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right, Darren.
And it needs to be a fluid process.
I think those are two key points: the fluidity, the varying levels, and then and so, being aware of what tools are in the toolkit and knowing which tool to use for which intervention, so you don't select a spanner if you want to hammer a nail or something. Yeah,
most definitely. And Toby, is there anything, do you want to reflect at all around the skills deficit, if there was one? I don't want to make assumptions on you in relation to your project.
Yeah, sure. I think to answer the previous question that you asked as well, in terms of kind of engagement fatigue, to go back to that a little bit. So with our project, we largely used VCS groups to do the engagement with residents. So actually the residents that were being engaged were, some of them were from kind of meetings that they held regularly with that VCS group that are kind of related to that target group, but most of them are actually people that hadn't necessarily engaged with the council before. And I think because we took that step back and let the VCS groups host those relationships, which I think was the right thing to do. And obviously the skills deficit from ourselves is that we didn't have the capacity or possibly the ability to kind of hold those conversations with the community, because it didn't feel like on this topic we were the right relationship to do that with. That actually I think that meant that there wasn't so much engagement fatigue in terms of the people that we engage with. I would say on the flip side of that, the VCS groups that we used are the same VCS groups that we asked to come to many events, and they definitely do have engagement fatigue. So our fatigue was actually with the VCS groups rather than the participants.
Yeah, which is interesting, very, very interesting. And how do you overcome that challenge?
Yeah.
So before we jump into doing our own kind of skills audit, are there any questions for Clive or Toby based upon their earlier presentation or their response in this panel? So you're welcome to kind of unmute. I can see one raised hand.
I think that's me, Darren. Shall I jump in?
Please go for it. I can't spot your name, sorry.
No, that's so my name's Jean Taylor. I work at Haringey Council, and we're doing a lot of thinking about participation at the moment, with a really kind of strong focus on on equity and kind of diversity of voice. It's kind of part of a program of work that's currently being described as kind of the Haringey deal, but which will have a kind of reach into, for example, kind of VCS kind of relationships. So I suppose I was just really interested in kind of Toby's kind of points that you've just made about kind of your experience of kind of working with the VCS, and I just had two questions. I think kind of the first was about kind of capacity for data collection, amongst kind of VCS organisations. I think we're really kind of clear that that working with VCS organisations will often offer us kind of greater reach, but I suppose wouldn't always be sure whether there would be the kind of the data kind of collection kind of skills and capability that would give us the kind of quality of evidence that we need to really inform robust kind of decision making. So just be good to hear any reflections from you or the rest of the group on what if anything you feel can be, well, firstly, whether you think that's a fair kind of concern, and secondly, kind of what do you do about it? And then the second is I suppose in our work, as I'm sure many of you are doing, what we're trying to do is to share power differently, is to foster kind of community power, and to get people thinking differently about the roles that they can play in their kind of communities and relative to public service. And again, I suppose with the VCS, I'm just kind of conscious that sometimes the VCS will bring kind of frames to the interaction with the kind of the council that that aren't always kind of consistent with the kind of direction of travel that we want to kind of go in. They do still kind of sometimes reflect a rather kind of paternalistic kind of relationship where we give money and the kind of sector kind of goes and does something, and that's not where we're at kind of financially, but it's also not the relationship we want to kind of create. So just again, welcome any kind of reflections on how do you foster a different type of relationship with the VCS for the purpose of kind of really developing wider kind of participation kind of conversations and relationships.
Thank you for that question. Toby, do you want to try and respond?
Yeah, I think they're really good questions. I think I can answer the first one. I think the second one's harder. So the first one in terms of capacity for data collection, yeah, I completely agree. We recognise that. So in my presentation last week, I talked about the kind of 20 workshops that the VCS groups held for us. So we had 9 VCS groups doing them. We had a council officer just sat in the back of the room. We didn't have a badge on or anything. We were just there to take notes. Like, we just got mentioned at the start that, Toby is here to take notes. So in terms of the actual data collection from the sessions, we had a council officer there to support that. And I think that worked quite well. It didn't feel like we were intruding on the space. We tried to kind of be as appropriate as possible with kind of who we sent from our team. But I think generally that worked quite well. So in terms of the data collection, we kind of got what we wanted. I get that wouldn't always be possible. We also had we also used a kind of local organisation that are experts in facilitation, and they supported the workshops as well, so that actually the conversation didn't steer dramatically off on tangents. It obviously did quite a lot of the time, but not dramatically and not permanently, which I think really helped as well. So that's how we kind of work with them in terms of data collection. Because I agree, we were concerned about kind of not getting that, not getting what we needed from them. In terms of the second one, in terms of kind of working differently, I mean, I wouldn't call it paternalistic, but we paid the VCS groups for their time, because they had to host the workshops and facilitate them, organise venues. So we did offer them the financial kind of contribution to support doing those workshops, which definitely helped. The kind of sharing power and relationship conversation is is a lot more difficult. And I think our communities team, which is kind of being built up over the last couple of years, being brought back in house, I think are kind of grappling with that at the moment, and kind of how do we make sure that VCS groups don't just see us as a transactional relationship, and it is more of kind of integrated approach. But yeah, there's not an easy answer to that.
Thank you, Toby.
Darren, there was Femi also had a hand up, I can see.
Yeah, she did. Yeah. So, but before we get to Femi, can I just jump to Anna, because she had a response also for Jean. So you typed a response, Anna. I don't know if you wanted to verbalise it.
Sorry, did you say Hannah?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi everyone. It's Hannah from the LGA. I was just off what Taylor was saying about moving away from transactional relationships between councils and the VCS. We're doing a big project at the LGA on that, which should be published in September. And the idea is we've created a bit of a typology of different types of relationships councils hold with the VCS. And the idea is to help councils and VCSs move along that typology to a more strategic relationship. So yeah, fingers crossed it's published in September, but I'll definitely share around the group.
Excellent. Thank you, Anna. And if we move to Femi.
Hello, Femi's a he, by the way.
Okay.
Not a problem. Just two questions. It's just first of all, I'll just throw this out to everyone. With the focus on participation, did you use any bespoke participation methods, either midway or summative? You know, anything that actually kind of critiqued or commented on the degree of participation? And secondly, on the terms of data analysis, after you've done the project, what did you do with the data? Did you how did you ensure it had a legacy past the project and didn't just end up on yet another report? Was there some way of ensuring that it had a life past did you put it somewhere, or did you consider putting it somewhere so it had a life past the, what do you call it, the project end date?
Thank you, Femi. So the two questions, one was on a repository. So did Clive, I don't know, Clive, have you historically used a repository? Do you know of a repository? And then the second one is around tailored methods. So I don't know if you both want to address those questions.
So no is the answer, and I probably should be, and I'm sure there are many repositories that we could probably, you know, benefit from. So I suppose, you know, it's in a sense it's the the broader power dynamic that I referred to in my very first presentation, where there's a, you know, potential disparity or unequal allocation of resource. And I would imagine that if we had, you know, substantive resource, we could certainly be, you know, far further in this democratic accountability space than we'd like to be, or than we are, shall I say? Sorry.
Thank you, Clive. Did you want to respond at all, Toby, or?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the data analysis, in terms of the legacy of that, so after our community conversations, we then had our EDI Making a Living Summit. So the data analysis, actually those challenges and solutions I mentioned that came out of that analysis, we used that on the first day of the summit with like cut out cards. So literally just like, this is the challenge, this is the solution, and got the participants at the summit to kind of start thinking about that and kind of what are the areas of challenge. So that then fed directly into the recommendations that they ended up delivering as part of the strategy, which hopefully won't be left on the shelf. We're currently writing the delivery plan, which is going to have kind of costed and measurable interventions under each of those recommendations. So there's a tangible link to the data, but in terms of the actual data itself, yeah, that's still just on a spreadsheet on Teams at the moment.
Oh, thank you. And so just moving on, I'm going to pull up a interactive screen. On this screen, there's I'll take you through the first few slides. Can you see it okay? I can see your face, Toby, so if you can just give me a thumbs up.
Yep, can see it fine.
Perfect, excellent. So yeah, so this is really a bit of a skills audit, what I'm trying to capture really from members on the call. But before we get to the scale itself, I just wanted just to remind you just around really the universe, the principles initially in where we will be doing participatory policy making. And so this is a slide or an image really from Nesta. And the 6 principles in which we will be developing our skills and our capacity within. The first one is building on people's existing capabilities. So how do we kind of mobilize that and approach that? Recognizing people as assets, mutuality and reciprocity. So both parties or all parties need to benefit. Facilitating rather than delivering, which is a kind of change in our, again, our kind of relationship and the power dynamics. Peer support networks, understanding that it's not just when we interact or when we engage with residents or members of the public that is the only space in which they may need support. So it's about creating additional alternative spaces, what will facilitate peer support. And the blurring distinctions, and I guess this is about who is the expert when we're engaging with residents, and privileging the multiplicity of expertise, what's involved, and all that shifting of the boundaries, what needs to be managed. If we go on to the next slide, my computer cooperates. There we go. So in terms of examples of contributions from parties involved, so by professional, I'm referring to the policymaker. And so in terms of what we can bring to the party, resource understanding. So that in essence is about bringing in the right expertise to help facilitate the process. So Toby's also spoken about the work of the VCS and bringing in their support in terms of their relationships, problem solving, decision making, and previous experience. So we've got obviously the historical knowledge of how policies being developed, services being commissioned and services are being decommissioned to help determine what comes next. So they're the set of kind of contributions what the policy officer can make. In terms of the service user or the general public, of course, they bring their lived experience, so their expertise of using services, living in the community and raising families in the community and working in the community. Again, they bring their problem solving skills. So on the ground, what does this need to do and look like? Decision making as well, and this kind of anchors into Clive's area of work under scrutiny. And also bringing fresh perspectives. This is people's lived realities. And so they are able to bring new, fresh and aspirational ideas to whatever policy you're aiming to develop. Co-production seems to be the methodology, the favoured methodology at the moment, but co-production is an umbrella term. And if we kind of scrape back and look behind what is co-production, it generally means 4 different type ways of working with residents. That can be co-planning, which is the most commonly used, and that could be right at the bottom of the ladder from consultation to residents taking the lead, co-designing, co-delivery, and co-assessment. And so they're really the 4 kind of levels. They aren't mutually exclusive. You can be engaged with residents doing all 4 types of activities or 4 levels of activities, or be using them discreetly. And so we've got the principles, we've got what you can bring and what the resident can bring, and we've got how to pitch or to level their involvement. So based upon that, what I'm going to ask you to do is register. If you go on your mobile or your PC and type in www.meti.com, and then you'll see a screen and a box what will allow you to put in the code. And I'm going to give you 5 to 10 minutes just to rate these 4 areas in relation to your organisation's skill deficit in order to do the previous 3 slides, that type of work. So question 1, is there a deficit in skills to engage, influence and create impact? 2, is the biggest deficit in knowledge and intellectual abilities? 3, is the biggest challenge governance and organisation skills? Or 4, is it about personal effectiveness skills? So I'm going to give you a short while. Oh, excellent. People are logging in. So skills to engage and influence and create impact is the forerunner. So if I give you just a couple more minutes just to cast your final vote. Okay, excellent. So thank you for that. Okay, so if we start to unpick what we mean then by skills to engage, influence and create impact, could I have a volunteer who kind of voted, who rated that? And just to explain exactly what skills to influence and to create impact your organisation is lacking from your perspective. Any volunteers? Okay, is it Suzanne?
It's Susan, yeah.
Susan, sorry, yes.
So I at the moment I'm talking about the London Borough of Redbridge, where we've been doing a nearly 4 years process of co-design. So I think the skills and the commitment to sharing power is absolutely evident in the team. So I don't think they need the skills around there. Sometimes it's about which technique to use for the best. So looking at the range of sort of strengths-based techniques, which one should we use at which time to create the biggest impact. But I also think there's something about doing this so the skills to be able to persuade the organisation that this isn't an add-on, that it isn't a kind of nice thing to do. How do you persuade people that this is business as usual? And so when we're thinking about our budget lines, that we should factor in a budget to support and help the community to really share power with us. I think that can be, I've seen a colleague who I work with do that absolutely brilliantly, really sort of making a business case for it and fully understanding that if you don't have the community at the heart of this, this will end up costing you a lot more money and be difficult in terms of reputation. So I think there's something about learning how to hardwire this work so it is sort of business as usual.
Thank you, that's really insightful. Jean?
So thanks. So I think that the point I was going to make probably builds on kind of Susan's, and I found myself kind of kind of certainly thinking about kind of some of the kind of the skills and kind of competency that we were trying to develop. So kind of to Susan's point about understanding of when you use different methods and what for and what they can add. But I kind of hesitated to kind of put my hand up because I've not been to the previous sessions, and it felt that there was something even before you get to skills that was really kind of fundamental. But I think Susan's kind of pointed to it, and that's about the kind of the frame that we bring to our kind of our role, whether it's as kind of as decision makers or kind of policy makers. I suppose our kind of set of assumptions about what gives us the the authority to kind of to build policy, where kind of where that comes from, and it's almost like bias, really. I think we need to kind of sort of start as a kind of as a profession, start challenging the kind of the set of assumptions we bring to our to our assumptions about kind of who makes kind of policy, and as a starting point have a kind of quite different kind of philosophy about what makes credible democratic kind of legitimate policy, even before we start talking about skills. Sorry, I'm going to leave it there because I'm getting a bit of feedback, but it's something a bit more kind of foundational even before you get to skills. And then I suspect that when we get into skills, there is then something about how do what are the skills that we need to kind of open up policy making sort of processes, whether that is about disability inclusion and accessibility, whether it's about cultural competence, whatever it may be, but something even before that is about kind of how do we think about our kind of role as policymakers.
No, that's again very, very insightful and useful. And I kind of jotted a note down of developing a reflective practice. I don't know whether that fits exactly what you're describing, but it's definitely occupied that type of space. And definitely unearthing those biases and assumptions, which is key and essential. George, and welcome to the call.
Hello, everyone. Sorry I was late. So I think that's a very interesting one, and actually reminded me a couple of years ago we tried actually to map participation across the council to understand how different services kind of practice participation. We tried to use kind of a typology which linked to kind of the ladder from kind of consultation to feedback. We split kind of code design and code deliver, because for us code deliver was, for example, volunteers delivering services with us. So this is how we kind of we had the code delivering as an element, and we also had civic action as a thing kind of overall, where we as a council were trying to empower individuals and community do their own thing, participate in their communities without us being in control or as part of the process. So I think that kind of exercise showed that there were some service areas of the council that they were trying to push for innovation, like on a daily kind of basis. Like everything they were doing were trying to kind of embed participation and engaging with residents and having that kind of co-production approach. Others were more kind of traditional, and they were kind of ad hoc, trying to use those kind of methods. So that reminded me of that kind of term that is used as kind of digital maturity, that we use for different organizations. And I was thinking, the term of like participatory maturity of, an organization, and where you are in that kind of scale, where you just use it very traditionally because you even have to, because you need to produce like an annual, adults services kind of report, to I'm actively using it because I actually see the value of it. So it was we never actually ended up with like a result in that sense, because other priorities took over at that point. But it was, I think, an interesting approach to think about that kind of maturity of the organization in terms of participation and what they are.
Yeah, no, and that's a very interesting terminology, actually, co-production of maturity, or maturity of co-production. And again, that was our starting point in Newham, in the sense of knowing there's pockets of really good practice, there's areas where there's ad hoc co-production, and it's about getting that consistency and sharing best practice as much as possible across the organisation to lift everybody and to lift everybody's competences. So that is, so that's a very key and essential point. If I move on, and it's related now, what you scored second, Iris, was a deficit in governance and organisation skills. Does anybody want to speak and unpack that a bit more? What do we mean by that? Governance and organisational skills. No, no takers. Oh, yeah, there's a few ands. So is it Kevin? I can see.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can do, yes.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm a bit of a kind of imposter here because I'm actually from Bradford, but I've participated in some of your sessions, and first of all, I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you for allowing me to, and how beneficial I found it. So just very quickly, I've just one of the things I've just written or in the process of completing is an anti-poverty strategy for Bradford, and I'm sure all of you are very familiar with the kind of problems of deprivation that many of our communities face. And although I have some stuff in which are quotes from people about lived reality, one of the things that struck me was that from a policy perspective, I kind of like sit actually in my kitchen writing from behind a desk. And I know there's loads of things happening across the council and with partners, and lots of really, really highly skilled people out in communities. But what I found really difficult was that there wasn't a kind of overarching strategic governance system and set of mechanisms that allowed for the strategy to be co-produced with the people, after all, who are the most important people in the strategy. So there's lots of really brilliant examples of great and innovative practice, but nothing at the broad political level or policy level that allows a structure around which those skills, capacities, and the people doing the work can be supported in terms of co-production. I don't know if that makes sense or chimes with anybody else's experience.
From my perspective, it definitely dovetails into what has been said earlier and relates to the governance in terms of a framework or a roadmap, what is definitely needed but often absent. And it's whether we're talking at an organisational, regional or national level, what level are you coming from?
That's a brilliant question. I don't have brilliant answers, by the way, but it is a brilliant question. One of the things I'd written in the strategy, and again, I don't know if this will make sense to people, is that we needed to think about joining up, which is a much abused phrase, I think, at a kind of horizontal level. So how are we working with our kind of organisations and partners in terms of place leadership? And then at a vertical level, in terms of how are we working at regional and national level, both on integrating with opportunities and funding opportunities and programs that are working, but also on how we lobby for a particular kind of set of approaches in policy. So there's a horizontal and vertical aspect to both of those things.
Well, thank you. And we'll definitely pick that up. And I think that goes into later workshops, really, when we're looking more strategically how we kind of embed and scale out and scale up participatory work. But what you did touch upon, which other speakers have touched upon, is this lobbying, both internally and externally, for greater understanding around participatory work with the community. So I've taken a note of all that. And just finally on this section, we've got two final ands. So we've got Tara, if I pronounce your name correctly.
Yep.
And
yeah, hi.
Also Jessica following.
Yeah, should I go first?
Please, yeah.
Great. Okay, so I had governance and organisation skills as my number one, really. And the reason why, because I agree with a lot of what Kevin has said, there is something about leadership and leadership that is required to turn what might be an organisational commitment to co-production or co-design or whichever an organisation wants to support. But then there is the process of implementing that commitment. And I think the way to do that, it seems to me, is going down the governance route, because my experience of local government is that what gets scrutinised gets done. And I think without that scrutiny process, I'm 3 years into public sector employment, and it's a steep learning curve every day. But it seems to me that officers who are required to say how they are implementing that commitment to co-production will seek out support and resources to do it, because they know we know we will be scrutinised against it. So I think there is something really important in ensuring that wherever there might be an organisation, or in our case, political commitment to co-production, that needs to come with a mechanism for measuring progress towards, or else it doesn't happen, because the comfort zone culture is very much traditional consultation, and a resistance in some respects to the idea of power sharing. So I think it requires leadership at all levels, but particularly from in a local authority, from the political administration, to ensure that commitment turns into action, or else residents, third sector organisations, sort of start to see holes in that commitment and then start to disengage with it. So yeah, so for me it's number one, but yeah, it's about leadership. You're on mute, Darren.
Thanks for reminding me. I was in full flow there as well. But it reminds me of a question from last week, what was posted in the chat, what was problematising how do you turn participatory policy making, the governance relationships around it, in order for it to underpin service delivery. And I think you've answered that question really eloquently, really, the relationship with scrutiny. And if I can just bounce that back just very briefly to Clive, in relation to, does it feature in your scrutiny work at Newham, this idea of co-production and involving residents?
So when we were invited to think about deficits, I would have mentioned that as a conceptual deficit, which we've recognized as having to fill in relation to our scrutiny improvement program, which Noel and I have just developed together with the Centre for Governance and Scrutiny. So to the extent that it will feature in future, and to the extent that we will build in all of this participatory expertise and knowledge and approaches, I would suggest that the track record has been an impoverished one, and that is about to change substantively, looking at the way forward. So I suppose that'll tell you straight away that, you know, to the extent that the varying sort of versions of co-production that you helpfully described earlier on your slide, if they've been applied, or if they've been thought of, or if they've been implemented, have been, you know, on an ad hoc basis. So for example, again, using the Black Boy piece that we're doing now, there's a huge amount of co-production in its purest senses, as you described there, in relation to wanting to articulate the voices of those marginalized and disadvantaged. In fact, the whole purpose of the review, because you can think about all the reviews that have happened across the decades, and so one of the key questions is, if we know that there's this systemic institutionalized stuff happening, why, and we've had all these reports into it, why are the outcomes still the way they are? And so yes, we're certainly turning that whole approach around and saying we start with the Black boys themselves, and we end in a different place, and the whole idea of them being participants, active, fully engaged participants, in ultimately also producing recommendations. But that has not it's been patchy, you know. Sometimes we've done something along these lines, sometimes we haven't, and the whole idea is then, of course, to, you know, to genuinely, as we say, put our residents at the heart of all we do. And if you think about it, that's really what we're saying here is, you know, we want to, you know, do that more and more effectively, also through these kinds of networks, and the work that all colleagues across all councils here are sharing. And I must say, this sharing and this network and all these ideas that are coming out through these sessions is invaluable for someone like me, and thinking again about, you know, how I translate this to the policy makers. Because ultimately, for me, it's not only, when we talk about co-production, about, you know, the democratic accountability space. It's the people with power. It's the people who have actual power, who are the implementers, who can shape the world, and it's about us influencing, but it's about them understanding as well that co-production means they ought to take us seriously. They ought to engage with us on an equal playing field, and they ought to think about us as a very valuable resource, not a pain in the neck, like a bee sting occasionally. This whole idea of holding to account and how people in power react to that. So I think there's a lot for us in terms of co-production, not only in relation to residents and all the key stakeholders, but also in redefining the power relationship that exists if you talk about governance, and if you talk about power structures, and if you talk about how that plays out in relation to policy making. Then the key question for me is how best to utilize the structures that exist within an institution to achieve objectives in the best way possible. Sorry, I don't know if that answered your question, but
no, it really does, and thank you for that. No, that was very useful, Clive. So thank you. If I can jump over to Jessica before I introduce Beth, who's going to kind of share her experience. And thank you for joining, Beth. I can see you on the call. So Jessica, very briefly, please.
I think a lot of what I was going to say has been covered really well by Clive and Tara and Kevin, actually. But my own observation is that it's the perennial challenge of how you maintain those values of co-production when you're bringing things back into the hierarchies, because quite often that's where the block sits, and it's about the representation and the power sharing as it kind of breaks down within leaders around those governance structures. So I'm going to misquote somebody, but it's what do we talk about when we talk about co-production? And I think that's a question for leaders, and that reflexive practice that you mentioned, Darren. And I think it's also, I was struck by a quote from an American organisation, it's kind of walking that co-productive practice back into the guts of a system to make those changes around hierarchies and governance, and people like power and cleave to power, and we need that reflexive space for leaders to understand how they can govern in a co-productive, participatory way. So that's kind of where I am with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. And next week, just as a note, what we'll be focused on is hopefully having a discussion to find some solutions and best practice around tackling what is very clear to me: hierarchy, structure, power relationships, and also understanding your role reflectively as a practitioner in navigating and negotiating all of that stuff. Before we end the call, though, so we've got Beth from Suffolk Council. Before you joined, Beth, we were just really having a recap of last week, and then we moved on to talk about, I guess, skills deficits, which is probably more broader. It's probably more institutional deficits, really, we've been talking about, as well as skill deficits. So if you don't mind just reflecting on your challenges, your experiences of doing participatory policy making from your context.
Cool. Hi. So really good to see you, Darren, and I'm very much I feel like I'm mostly an observer and listener in these meetings, and I just learn so much. It's just great to all be figuring it out together, and sort of live processing it actually is just really helpful, and it just keeps you open and flexible and reflexive, which I just really value. So thanks just to the group and to Noel and Darren for just pulling us together, like herding cats, I imagine, a lot of the time with us. In Southwark, I'm strategy and change manager in Southwark Council, and we are, like everybody, I think, looking at how to become more relational, more together, to evolve in response to what we're learning. And where I'm sitting in all of it is thinking about kind of corporately, how do we sort of embed this so that change lasts? So my background is kind of change management and multidisciplinary working, and how do you make multidisciplinary, multi-organisational teams function healthily? So I'm generally obsessed with communication, information sharing and trust, because that's what makes people from different perspectives work well together. We are just beginning. When I say just beginning, I mean the resource to help us do it is landing in August. So we are we're nascent at the moment, looking at developing a borough plan that sort of just articulates a vision for the borough. And that for us is really creating a burning platform we've needed for a long time. So we've talked about being more participatory. We have a number of, and as someone else on the call was talking about, there being lots of great pilots out there on the ground, but it not necessarily all coming together. And I'd say we're definitely in that situation. Lots of innovation, but corporately consistency is just an issue that we're really encountering. And that borough plan for us is creating a burning platform for change. So the issue that we have in Southwark is often our services look pretty great, but I think there is a bit of a time limit on how much longer that lasts, and we need to be working together differently to embed the good stuff and to start to evolve. So we've got this borough plan coming, which is going to make really visible the need to become more relational and to start being different, our how evolving, not just our what. You know, I think we've talked about that a lot in this group in different ways. You know, and we're looking at our, our relationship, our connectivity with communities, with partners, internally, you know, how are our services shaped by our relationship with partners and communities? How is our governance? How is our policy? How's our strategy? And for me, the thing that I'm really interested in is looking at all the enablers in the organisation that help to start to embed change. So when I talk about enablers, I'm thinking about culture first and foremost, data and insight, technology, sort of hardware, structure, how are we arranging ourselves, and assets. So what do we have in hand? Capital assets that we hold or that we use or that we have influence over. So our GP practices are looking at redesigning some of their capital, you know, they've got a capital programme going on. How do we shape that? So that's culture, insight, data, technology, structure and assets. And so what we're looking at is how do we engage the leaders that sort of drive and shape those assets, where the enablers, where that's in place, and how do we have a joined up conversation between the people that kind of really hold that space. Governance isn't listed there. I think it kind of comes within structure. I think governance is more interesting when tackled as part of the kind of mesh of the system rather than a specific enabler, purely because, you know, and I mean, my temperament is kind of path of least resistance, and I find that governance often responds to demand, but going to governance say you should change in advance of this demand, it can be a challenging conversation. So I think it's just about sort of timing. But we really at the very beginning of our journey, in terms of thinking about how do we start to really evolve. We've had a sort of somewhat federated structure in the organisation. Departments have an awful lot of delegation and sort of autonomy, and so starting to think about interdependency. It's quite scary. You know, we're going to have to slow down. We're going to have to not do everything we want to do. You know, we're going to have to. Well, I mean, the irony is, so I'm in a, you know, I think it's the same as in relationships, isn't it? You have to compromise, and you have to like really believe that the relationship is worth the compromise. And you're just starting to build that confidence in relationships. So I think what I'm really glad to have now is agreement with the chief executive about what those enablers are, and agreement on who we want to be bringing in and working with to start to talk about evolving and embedding change in the organisation. From where I'm sitting, it's going to be 3 years to really articulate and start the change, 5 years before we're rolling, and 10 before it's embedded. So this is not a quick win by any means, but it is about how do we start to, at a very structural level, start to evolve ourselves. So my kind of lens in all this is sustainability, and kind of how do we assure that this change really lasts and outlasts any one officer, because we have got some incredibly passionate officers in Southwark, really phenomenal innovators, entrepreneurs, you know, expert relators. But if they leave, I want to know that it's all going to stick. And I want to know that it's not going to cost the residents. I want to know that the return on investment for residents when they contribute is really good and really delivers over the long term, that it might be a lost leader for them, but over time they can have confidence that they're going to get return on their investment in us. So I think that sustainability is what we think, and that's why I focused in on enablers, really. I mean, that's a serious nutshell, but I'd say that's where we are in Southwark. And you know, we're not all of one mind. We're definitely working through it as a kind of leadership team, and kind of going through a process to get to a compromise where we feel like we understand and the real essentials are being kind of prioritised and held. But I think that focus on enablers corporately has really helped make it real and decide who's in and out of the conversation just to get some stuff agreed. That's been really, really helpful as a start. But yeah, a long way to go for us. Anyway, so I have no idea how helpful that is, Darren, but that was what I was thinking about. We had a chat yesterday.
No, that was very, very helpful, Beth, because it really just encapsulates our discussion today, really, within one authority, which is yours. And you've kind of offered a very kind of pragmatic and smart way to approach the challenge. Although I hear what you're saying, it may take up to 10 years to actually see the fruition of this challenge, which who knows what can happen over the next decade to kind of throw that from that kind of trajectory. But very useful, and thank you for joining us and sharing that. And I'm conscious that the time has gone over 11 now, so if I can jump over to Noel, really, again, any reflections from yourself, Noel, or any guiding points at this moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's one thing that's kind of loud and clear is kind of how we embed participation. I think Jean put it in the chat, so I'm gonna kind of steal her phrase, into the guts of the organisation, not just into how people who are doing participation can do it better, which the latter is still important. I think kind of the second one, which probably links into next session actually, is it'd be really great to be able to see what people and organisations want to live test this out on kind of specific projects, so that we can really get into it. You know, one person might be testing at a particular strand, another one kind of another. But yeah, really live testing some of this, because there's nothing better than being able to tell you're kind of a leader in your organisation that like there's 2 other councils who are also doing this, in terms of trusting the kind of the process. But it's been a really great discussion. I've learned so much.
Yeah, and I would echo what Noel said as well. It's been a really, really rich and great discussion today. And so I'll just remind you all to kind of register for next week, the 3rd of August, and then we'll have a break throughout the rest of August and reconvene in September. So thank you for your participation. Have a good day, and hopefully see you all again next week. Goodbye from me.
Cheers, Darren. Cheers, everyone.
Okay, bye everyone.